Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein On Gelt show Jeff Broide. He's a well-known CPA and tax specialist. He's the senior partner of Broide and Company. They provide professional services a lot to the Anglo community in Israel. And Jeff deals both in personal and corporate taxes. And even better is Jeff is a returning customer to the Goldstein On Gelt show. Jeff, real pleasure to have you back.
Thanks, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here.
Since we last spoke, it seems like the whole tax world is almost exploding. It's been simmering, and now it's really getting a lot worse in terms, especially of international tax. Am I reading the situation right?
Very much so, Doug. There has never been so much exchange of information between treaty countries. The OECD has its foot on the gas and is pressurizing members. New agreements of disclosure are being closed with non-treaty and offshore jurisdictions. Banks are committed to supplying information on clients. IDA officials, that's the Israel Tax Authority, state openly that they have never had so much information available.
Okay, so before we go into the key topic I want to discuss today, which has to do with amnesty and foreign trusts, I'd just like to ask a moment of philosophy. If there's a sharing of information between tax authorities, doesn't that mean that the tax cheats are all going to have to come to the surface, and then honest tax-paying citizens like you and me will not have to pay their share, we'll only have to pay our fair share?
I think that's correct, Doug, but that's more in the realm of philosophy than advising on taxes. But I think that is the approach of tax authorities worldwide today.
Okay, so let's see now that we see the direction of this huge disclosure going on, tell me a little bit more what's going on regarding the new tax amnesty as it relates to foreign trusts.
First of all, the amnesty itself, which is fairly recent, was announced in September. The new amnesty is separate to a certain extent from the new trust legislation, which possibly we might come back to. I think the real issue here with the amnesty is that the risks of non-disclosure today are substantial. And this new voluntary disclosure procedure enables taxpayers to clear the record and join the tax mainstream. In fact, for the first 12 months of the new amnesty, the applications may be done anonymously. Under certain circumstances, there's a fast route available for relatively smaller amounts of assets and income. You might call this smaller offenders. It is also important to note that residential property owners who have not reported on rental income may do so today with minimal reporting and taxes. I know I haven't dealt with the trust issue. If you'd like, Doug, I can deal with that now or later.
Well, let's touch on that in a minute. Let me focus a little more on what it means to go into an amnesty. Let's assume for a moment that either on purpose or by accident, you weren't properly filling out your taxes for years. What does it mean to go into the amnesty? Nuts and bolts, tachlis. What does it look like for a person to do that?
Well, it means essentially going back anything up to 10 years, which is a pretty comprehensive and arduous path to take in terms both of obtaining documentation and so on, and then doing all the reporting and making the application. And just for the record, the amnesty can go back, the reporting requirement can go back up to a period of 10 years, generally speaking.
Is that normal, or is that just the possible?
No, it's 10 years is probably within the tax statute of limitations. Where the taxpayer died, there's a shorter period available. But we're not advising clients to die. And then the ITA has indicated that the penalties will not be levied, which makes that somewhat attractive, as does the possibility of submitting an anonymous application and only disclosing details once there's agreement with the tax authorities.
I see. So there's a process, and you would go to some. Is this something people can do on their own, or do they need a tax professional to help them?
Very much so. It's certainly not advisable to do it on your own, and it requires professionals with expertise in dealing with amnesty applications and the tax authorities.
Mm-hmm. And what happens if someone doesn't go for the amnesty?
Well, as I tell many people, then it depends on what I call their level of risk tolerance. If the tax authorities obtain information and proceed with this, then of course it's a criminal inquiry, and non-reporting is a criminal offense with all that entails, and the tax and related damages, related meaning penalties and so on, are very substantial.
All right, so we won't go down that route. Any listener of the Goldstein On Gelt show who thinks that you might have a problem, definitely seek counsel to determine whether you need to get into the amnesty program to get yourself straight on the path of being a good taxpayer. We're talking with Jeff Broide, who is a CPA, he's a tax specialist. His office is based in Jerusalem, and he deals a lot with international tax. And now let's talk about the trust issues. Jeff, I know that there have been a number of changes in terms of trusts. A lot of the people that I talk to in my day job as a financial advisor, they may live in Israel, and their parents in America or grandparents left money to them in a trust. And maybe there were a few grandchildren, and they each received some distribution every year. And for years, it seemed as though that was a pretty good tax-free income, at least from an Israeli standpoint. Tell us how things have changed and what people need to look out for.
Well, without getting too technical, Doug, till the end of 2013, essentially, if the trust was a foreign trust, in other words, settled, or the grantor was non-resident in Israel, and there were Israeli beneficiaries, those trusts, subject to various conditions, in fact, were exempt from both reporting and being taxed in Israel. As of 2014, the mere existence of an Israeli resident beneficiary of the trust renders the trust reportable and taxable in Israel, at least to the extent of such a beneficiary's entitlement within the trust. So if, for example, there are 5 beneficiaries and one is resident in Israel, and such a beneficiary is determined to be entitled to, say, 20% of the assets or income of the trust, then such 20%, the 20% of the income, is reportable and taxable in Israel. And that's the major change. In other words, no beneficiary any longer escapes the being taxed on a trust simply because the grantor or settler was a foreign resident.
But what if that trust is already being taxed in its local country?
Generally, the tax treaties provide for the set-off of foreign tax credits, and the ITA is doing just that. Even with countries where there aren't treaties, they will allow set-off of taxes, and in fact, the truth is, Doug, that in certain cases, the taxes may be higher in the countries of origin than they are here in relation to the trust taxation, in which case there would be no additional taxes to pay. But if there are, it would be after set-off. There certainly wouldn't be double taxation here.
Mm-hmm. So it is possible. Maybe are people getting too worked up over this because they're saying, oh my gosh, I never had to report, and now I have to both report and potentially pay tax to Israel. But what you're saying is that if they were paying tax in the country where the trust was originally set up, then they might not actually owe tax to Israel, though they would have to pay, though they would have to report?
Yeah, that's correct. I think that people get worked up. That's more in the realm of psychology than taxes. But I mean, the law is very clear here. They do need to report, and beneficiaries who receive awards or distributions from a trust are required, independently of the trust reporting, to report on such awards in their personal tax returns.
So do other countries do this? Do other countries tax foreign trusts?
Generally speaking, the answer is yes. The U.S. has been taxing trusts for many decades. Some of the other Anglo-Saxon countries have done so for some time now, some in recent years. I think generally the rule is that they either tax the trust or the beneficiaries. But there are cases and there are countries where such trusts, subject to certain conditions, are not taxed, and that does seem to indicate that there are still some tax havens for trusts. But that depends really on country of residence, and certainly not the old definition of tax havens being these special islands and others that were basically specializing in this.
Okay, so let's leave off with a practical bit of wisdom for the Goldstein On Gelt listeners. If someone has a trust in the family, whether he knows the details or not, Grandpa set it up, or I've heard about it, or I get a check every year, what would be the appropriate step for him to do now in light of the new legislation?
He or she needs to consult with a tax professional, and they would have to provide trust documentation, trust reports if they're reporting in the countries where the trusts are located or they are resident. And based on that, they may or may not have to begin reporting, at least in 2014. Unfortunately, in many cases, they may well have been subject to reporting requirements prior to that. You may recall that trusts became reportable and taxable in Israel in 2006, and the ITA has an approach that if the beneficiaries who are resident in Israel had any ability to influence or control the trust or the trustees, then that trust should have been reporting here. But that, again, is getting a little technical, and they certainly need to take professional advice here before proceeding.
Okay, so I think that is the wisdom. The fact is the trust legislation is a little bit more complicated than just earning your salary and paying tax on it. And if you do have any instance of ownership or control, or if you're a beneficiary or you set up a trust, it's time to review those documents with someone who really knows what he's doing. Jeff, in the last few seconds, can you just tell us how can people learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
Well, I would refer them to our website, which is www.broide.com. And we'll be happy to field any questions generally, even by email. One final comment, Doug, that should be noted, and that is trusts are really not well known nor understood in Israel, as they originate from the Anglo-Saxon world. And therefore, due care should be taken in taking decisions on reporting.
Okay, I think that is...
Sorry.
I was going to say that sounds like very good wisdom for people who are living here. All right, Jeff, I think we're going to wrap it up because we're out of time, but I certainly appreciate your help. We're going to put a link to your website at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. So once again, Jeff Broide, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Goldstein On Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein On Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein On Gelt Show.